So that's what the true spirit of Anchorage is like. Donald Trump really wanted to hand over Donbass and Crimea to Vladimir Putin, and the negotiations with Iran have completely failed. The truce between the US and Iran is over. Tehran has closed the Strait of Hormuz again, supposedly because Israel shelled Lebanese Hezbollah. But the truth is that several hours before the strait was closed, it became known that the negotiations between the United States and Iran in Switzerland were finally cancelled today. Now Donald Trump insists that the US was not in a desperate position when they made a deal with Iran, but still will not resume their blockade against Iran. Meanwhile, there has been an unexpected turn regarding Ukraine. On one hand, it emerged that the US and Ukraine have started discussing a two-stage agreement to end the war and are even holding private talks with the Russians. On the other hand, Emmanuel Macron suddenly started revealing that Donald Trump was convinced Ukraine would lose, and that in Anchorage in August last year, the agreement was already practically on the table. Trump and Putin wanted to hand over to Russia the territories of Ukraine that hadn't even been captured by the Russian army yet. In the end, Trump failed, both with Ukraine and with Iran. My name is Alexei Peachy. Let's discuss both topics together in this episode. But before we start, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and drop any comment you want. So let's begin this episode with Iran. Donald Trump barely had time to declare victory over Iran, even claiming their capitulation to the US, and to publicly stage the signing of an agreement with the Iranians, when Iran announced today that it is withdrawing from the negotiations and once again announced the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And this happened on the very day when both sides were finally supposed to sign the actual agreements to end the war in Geneva. Jumping ahead, no meeting took place in Geneva today. Today, June 19th, Iran restricted the passage of ships through the Hormuz Strait. Warning shots were fired in the area of the strait, and the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps called on ships over the radio not to approach this zone. At the same time, Tehran stated that the passage of ships is still possible, but only if a prior application is submitted to the IRGC militants. They are approved only if the established requirements are met, which, as you can imagine, are set by Tehran. Iran stated that the reason for this decision was that today Israel carried out a series of strikes on Lebanon in response to a Hezbollah attack that killed 4 soldiers. Despite the memorandum between the US and Iran, which provides for the cessation of conflicts on all fronts, including in Lebanon. And in Tehran, they stated that they will not consider the war over until Israel withdraws all its troops from Lebanon. It's funny that just a couple of hours before the closure of the Hormuz Strait by Iran, Donald Trump loudly and publicly declared in an interview that he had already won and that Iran had capitulated. Trump believes that for Iran, signing a memorandum with America was an unconditional surrender. Trump admitted that he made the deal to prevent the war from escalating into a global economic crisis. And he added that the United States of America completely defeated Iran in a military sense. And Trump said that the Memorandum of Understanding is Iran's unconditional surrender. In addition, the war actually demonstrated America's military power, said Trump. And next, I'll give you his victorious quote. Let me emphasize again, keep in mind that he made this statement literally a couple of hours before Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz again today. A quote from Trump. Who else could organize such a blockade? I set up a naval blockade that was impenetrable, but not making a deal could have been disastrous. Trump stated that the war actually demonstrated military power there for another 2 or 3 weeks, and to keep bombing them half to death, right? He said, what will that give us? The Strait of Hormuz will not be opened. Our war has actually demonstrated this for months. While you are dropping military power, the system is shutting down. This is something that could cause a worldwide depression. However, I want to emphasize here that this was even before the war in the Middle East began. In February, even his vice president, J.D. Vance, warned Donald Trump that Iran could block the Hormuz Strait, but Trump didn't believe it. He said that the global depression predicted by the war Trump started the war, demonstrated America's military power. And not only that, he asked, what has Iran done today? The war actually demonstrated military power, but he couldn't win and couldn't foresee its consequences. And Trump said, listen, if we kept bombing Iran, the Hormuz Strait would have been blocked. Ha, right. He blocked it again. Despite the concessions, the war showed Trump's military strength. It would seem that Iran violated the terms of even the preliminary agreement and once again blocked the Hormuz Strait. The time has come to act, but what should be done? But no. Trump stated that the US would heroically endure all of this and abide by the terms of the deal he pompously signed yesterday in France. Trump stated again, quote, Trump said the war weakened Iran. Iran no longer has an air force, a navy, anti-aircraft equipment, radars, or practically anything else. But at the same time, the Democrats claim that Iran is better off now than it was 4 months ago. Can you imagine that? How can anyone be so foolish? But here, of course, the question is, who is really the foolish one in this whole story? According to Trump, Iran supposedly has nothing, but today Iran is blocking the Strait of Hormuz. And in response, Donald Trump said, quote, no, we didn't meet with the Iranians out of desperation. It was Iran that was desperate. They're finished. We will see these 60 days through to the end. They won't get any money, not even 10 cents. If you didn't understand, Trump stated that no matter what, he will unilaterally stick to this very 60-day ceasefire that was reached as part of the Memorandum of Understanding, which Iran has already violated. It's important to understand why this is happening. Iran has said it blocked the Hormuz Strait. Today, because Israel opened fire on Lebanon. But as of now, Israel and Hezbollah, after exchanging strikes, have reportedly agreed to a ceasefire again, supposedly with Washington's mediation. And it would seem that after this, Iran could well call off its actions. But no, Iran is not lifting the blockade of the Hormuz Strait. That's the first thing. Second, a few hours before Israel's shelling of Lebanon, it became known that peace talks would not take place. The talks between the US and Iran, which were supposed to take place today, June 19th, at the Bergenstock Resort in Switzerland, will not happen. This was officially announced by the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Besides Washington and Tehran representatives, mediators, in particular from Pakistan and Qatar, were also expected at the meeting. It was expected that the parties would discuss the implementation of the previously signed Memorandum of Understanding between the US and Iran, but the meeting was cancelled at the last moment, I emphasize, even before Israel's strikes on Lebanon. The White House had previously announced that US Vice President J.D. Vance cancelled his planned trip to Switzerland on June 19th. And here's what the White House said, quote, as the Vice President said, the plans for the upcoming technical talks have not yet been finalized, but the American delegation is ready to attend them at the first opportunity. The logistics of the talks. The logistics of talks with Iran have never been simple or predictable. At the same time, the cancellation of the meeting came as a surprise because dozens of White House officials, staff members preparing for the talks, and media representatives, including some of my fellow journalists, were already in Switzerland and getting ready for the visit of both sides. Everyone had already arrived, prepared, and was waiting for when the Americans and Iranians would sign this historic agreement to end the war. And this is where things get really interesting. Before the meeting was cancelled, the Iranian Tasnim agency released a statement saying that Tehran wants to see the implementation of the agreement's provisions with the US before the next stage of negotiations begins. In simple terms, Iran directly told the Americans, listen, we signed an agreement with you, but before we start doing anything under this agreement, let the Americans be the first to fulfill their part of the deal. And now, pay attention. Did you notice how Donald Trump exploded after the Strait of Hormuz was closed today and said, quote, they're finished. They won't get any money, not even 10 cents. You might ask, how is money involved? Why is Donald Trump focusing on this in particular? But the point is that, as part of the agreement, Donald Trump agreed to unfreeze billions of dollars in Iranian assets and also to create a $300 billion investment fund for the reconstruction of Iran. And friends, for those who didn't believe me and wrote in the comments that I'm lying, asking why I'm making up the part about the $300 million, it's actually written directly in the version of the document that the White House showed. And so Iran says, listen, give us the money first, lift the sanctions, unfreeze the assets, and then we'll think about whether we will even have any negotiations with you at all. That's why Trump lost his temper, and that's exactly why he wrote specifically about the money, and the Iranians just outplayed him. In short, today's shelling of Lebanon by Israel was just a pretext for Iran to close the Hormuz Strait. And this is where everything comes to a complete dead end. The thing is, the original agreement between the US and Saudi Arabia, Iran, caused rather sharp criticism from some members of the US Congress, particularly Republicans in Congress in both chambers. They are concerned that Washington has conceded too much to Iran. In this regard, J.D. Vance, Vice President of the United States of America, took a rather unusual step by appearing at the White House to defend this agreement with Iran. He argued that although it does indeed involve concessions, Iran must first meet the demands of the United States. Quote from J.D. Vance, "When they demonstrate more good faith behavior, we will be able to increase the economic benefits. If they stop acting in good faith, we can revoke these measures." As a result, we ended up in a situation where Iran is demanding that the United States of America take the first steps, and the United States of America is demanding that Iran act first. This is a deadlock. Well, let's see who blinks first in this situation. And something tells me that it will be Donald Trump again, because he's the one who's afraid of a collapse in the oil market, not Iran. Iran doesn't care. Iran is blocking the Strait of Hormuz and understands that in this situation, time is on their side. But Trump has already publicly stated directly that yes, he was afraid that this would turn into a global collapse and prices for everything around the world would skyrocket if the Strait of Hormuz remained closed. In addition, American officials familiar with the course of the negotiations told CNN that both sides are currently working on secret proposals to implement the agreements signed this week. But, as it turned out, Iran did not sign any additional documents, as was the case with the Memorandum of Understanding. And therefore, quote, "This raises the question of whether the Trump administration exaggerated the commitments it obtained from Iran. And it once again emphasizes how quickly fragile political efforts to reach a final agreement can collapse. Meanwhile, negotiations on Ukraine are moving into a completely new dimension. Finally, it has become clear what the Russians keep referring to as the spirit of anchorage. Donald Trump really wanted to hand over Ukraine to Vladimir Putin and negotiated with him about this in Alaska in August of last year. But before we move on to the second part of this episode, I want to ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel, give it a like, and write detailed comments. This will really help promote the content on YouTube. In addition, I want to let you know that we now have a private community on Patreon and Telegram. It's called Peachy Insight, where you can ask me direct questions. There, I personally discuss any topics with you. There's no self-censorship there. And there, together with you, we decide which topics we'll discuss next on this YouTube channel. And also, there are exclusive analyses there that won't appear here on YouTube. And there you also get exclusive access to private streams every month where there will be Q&A sessions, and to my daily analyses as well. The link to Patreon is in the description of this video. Be sure to join. But if you just want to support this YouTube channel with a one-time donation, I would be very grateful to you for that. All the links and details on how you can do this are also in the description. And subscribe to my social media. We connect there too. All the links and details are in the description of this video. Now let's continue. So, French President Emmanuel Macron shocked everyone with revelations about how Donald Trump actually tried to sell Ukraine to Vladimir Putin. And so, when Donald Trump became president of the United States, he thought that Ukraine would lose this war with Russia. According to Macron, Trump assured Europeans in private conversations that it was time for them to finally accept that Ukraine would lose and would eventually become part of Russia anyway. Like, let's just give it up together, that's it. Why are we even bothering with it? Next, I will quote Emmanuel Macron. Remember January and February 2025. He, meaning Trump, thought that Ukraine would lose. Everything went badly in the Oval Office during the meeting with Zelensky, and then the summit between Trump and Putin in Anchorage. It raised hopes for a deal in which Ukraine was simply offered to hand over territories that Russia hadn't even captured yet. Next, Macron added that after that, right in the middle of August 2025, he and other European leaders went to Washington, where they said, listen, Donald Trump, it's impossible to just give up Ukraine, and Europe will not allow it. As a result of these events, Trump saw that the statements about Ukraine's defeat were a huge lie. Next, another quote from Macron. Since then, a great deal has happened, and above all, that reflects the Ukrainians' victory, their abilities, and how convincing they have been. President Trump saw that everything he was told, that the Ukrainians would collapse, that they wouldn't survive the winter, that they would lose, turned out to be untrue. He saw that in front of him were courageous, resourceful people whom he now respects. But after that, Macron said something even more shocking. So, the French president basically confirmed live on air that in Anchorage in August 2025, the agreement was already practically on the table. And Donald Trump really wanted to give Vladimir Putin the territory of Ukraine in this agreement, which hadn't even been captured by the Russian army yet. This refers to parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And now looking back at the events in the Middle East, I come to a simple conclusion. If you want to understand what the spirit of Anchorage is, read the terms of the deal between the United States of America and Iran and try to find a place for Israel in it. In essence, Israel also got its own version of the spirit of Anchorage. Trump simply abandoned Israel when he realized that he had lost this war himself and needed to find a way out while saving face. At that moment, he absolutely didn't care about his allies, but fortunately Israel will survive just as Ukraine did. But then suddenly the situation changed after all the G7 leaders just this week carefully watched footage of Moscow burning together. The Economist writes today that the proposal for a peaceful settlement in Ukraine may include a phased plan similar to the one Donald Trump just agreed on with Iran. And this phased plan was discussed by Trump together with the Europeans at the G7 summit. As the publication writes, the failures of the Russian army and Ukraine's successes in striking it with drones, targeting its supply routes and facilities inside Russia itself, have begun to change Donald Trump's attitude toward the course of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. It turned out that representatives from Kyiv and members of his team are now holding daily consultations on how to force Russia to come to the negotiating table. And against this background, Trump actually stated that he is ready to put pressure on Putin and provide support to Ukraine. Let me be clear, Trump hasn't suddenly changed his mind or become a strong supporter of Ukraine. No, that's not the case, it's just situational. But nevertheless, the events in Russia, these explosions, burning oil refineries, showed Trump that, well, losers definitely don't look like that. And so, one of the ideas being discussed by Americans and Ukrainians is ending the war in two stages. First, it is proposed to cease hostilities along the current front line, extending 50 to 70 kilometers deep on each side. That is, the front line is frozen, and for 50 kilometers deep on each side, so actually a 100-kilometer zone 50 on each side, this area should have no fire, no shelling, nothing at all. And then, once this ceasefire is in effect, a broader agreement is reached for a complete ceasefire along all fronts and an end to the war. And according to The Economist, unofficial talks with Moscow have resumed. That's why we're now hearing so many public statements from Lavrov. He even wrote an entire article there in which he explained how the Europeans are wrong, how the Europeans are trying to use Ukraine as a united force to create a huge pan-European army, which will then go to war with the Russians. He wrote about how Europe is courting Ukraine, Moldova, now also Armenia, and so on and so on. And that in general, Europe is conducting negotiations the wrong way. That's where all of this comes from. It turns out that the Europeans, together with the Americans and Ukrainians, really did discuss at the G7 summit the ways to force Moscow to sit down at the negotiating table. But the problem is that in Ukraine, they are sure that Russia is unlikely to take any action before October. Why before October? Because at that time, Russia will want to support Donald Trump before the midterm congressional elections and get something in return. But most likely the Kremlin will stall until next spring, counting on the fact that another massive winter missile and drone campaign against Ukrainian cities and energy infrastructure will finally force Ukraine to make concessions to Moscow, and maybe even come close to capitulating. And in Moscow, they continue to insist that they are only ready for negotiations in the spirit of Anchorage, meaning that at the meeting in August 2025 in Alaska, Vladimir Putin allegedly reached an agreement with Donald Trump on handing over the entire Donbass to Russia and recognizing both de jure and de facto its control over Crimea and the occupied territories of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions. And now, according to Emmanuel Macron, we understand that Trump was indeed preparing to sell Ukraine out. And today at the end, Trump added a short but very telling statement. I'll quote him next and you'll understand everything perfectly. I'm not a big fan of Ukraine. Except for their women, they just keep winning the Miss Universe contest all the time. That's Trump's attitude toward the world's global problems. I'll leave it at that. Friends, subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and write your comments, your opinions, and your conclusions about these two global topics. And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. Be sure to follow me on social media, Instagram, TikTok, and of course my Telegram channel. There you'll find things that don't come out here on YouTube. That's all for now. Take care. Bye everyone.